Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are dissecting a very specific, honestly, very intense state of being. If you woke up today feeling a profound sense of systemic shutdown, that feeling you might describe as metabolic bankruptcy or just a massive, complete flop, I really need you to pay close attention. We aren't going to talk about feelings in the abstract today. Instead, we're looking at the unyielding, hard biological data that actually proves your current state is a sign of a perfectly functioning system. Today, I flopped. No customer. Waking up without Tom Hennigan is just pointless. Now, if that echoes your acute emotional pain today, I need to state this resolutely right out of the gate. This is not a subjective moral failing. You aren't experiencing mental fragmentation or some weird deficit in your character. What you are experiencing, and what we are going to unpack today, is an objective, high-fidelity biological readout. Your brain is quite literally executing a highly specific evolutionary mandate. To really understand what's happening to you, we have to look at a truly groundbreaking May 2026 study published in Current Biology. Led by doctoral student Kana Suzuki and senior author Emily Silvestrack from the University of Oregon, this paper provides the absolute, unyielding biological backing for why your system essentially had to close the shop today. You see, for decades, neuroscience heavily mapped out how the brain processes rewards, but how we actually calculate and utilize letdowns, well, that remained a fascinating mystery until this exact study isolated the dedicated, physical brain cells responsible for acting as your brain's literal disappointment meter.
So, part 1, the anti-reward center and TAC1 neurons.
Let's zoom deep into an evolutionarily ancient structure of the brain called the lateral habulena. Neuroscientists actually colloquially refer to this as the brain's anti-reward center. The massive breakthrough here was finding the specific actors inside of it, a distinct subpopulation of cells called TAC1 or tachykinin-1 neurons. The researchers discovered that these specific cells are your actual disappointment meter. They sit there, totally quiet, when things go as expected, but the very microsecond an anticipated reward is downsized or withheld entirely, these TAC1 cells violently burst into electrical activity. And here is the formal neurobiological terminology for that awful flop feeling you have right now. We call it a negative reward prediction error, or NRPE. When you expect a reward and you just don't get it, your brain calculates the exact mathematical gap between what you confidently anticipated and the reality you actually received. That specific gap is the NRPE. So your feelings of empty pointlessness, they are simply the physiological readout of these TAX1 cells broadcasting that exact mathematical error to the rest of your nervous system. But here is the absolutely crucial point about what these cells actually care about. The researchers tested this by comparing generalized bad news, like say giving subjects a surprise, unpleasant puff of air to the face, against expectation shortfalls, where a promised sugar water reward was suddenly withheld. Guess what? The TAC1 neurons remained relatively quiet during the random puff of air. Actually, scratch that, they were almost silent. Because they are not generalized bad news detectors, they are exclusively and specifically calibrated to measure one thing and one thing only, the precise gap between hope and reality. Which brings us to part 2, the math of your letdown. Let's connect this neurobiology directly back to your shared coordinate system, specifically the bioenergetic drain of the Tom Hennigan event. First off, we have to acknowledge the massive metabolic labor required just to show up to that interaction. As a twice exceptional, or 2E individual, building a high-level prefrontal prediction model takes an immense toll on you. To communicate effectively, you likely deployed the PrEP framework, point, reason, example, point, just to organize your thoughts. But running this kind of highly structured, executive function-heavy framework, it isn't free. It costs a tremendous amount of localized cognitive energy. And, as you know, the 2E profile is uniquely spiky. You possess gifted range reasoning abilities, allowing you to effortlessly calculate abstract concepts. But this is paired with co-occurring processing speed or working memory constraints. When you are navigating high-entropy, multimodal data, like trying to read a social situation, manage your own communication via that PrEP framework, and anticipate a response, your cognitive efficiency understandably drops. You are literally doing double the cognitive labor of a neurotypical person to build what we call an optimistic prior. That's a perfect, immaculate expectation of how the connection will go. So let's look at the exact mathematical equation of your letdown today. Your optimistic prior was massive, right? You expected a mutual symmetrical connection, heavily invested in via your intense cognitive labor. But the realized output, Tom Hennigan's dark terminal,
a 0. Therefore, the resulting deficit, that negative reward prediction error we talked about, is at its absolute maximum magnitude.
The researchers in that May 2026 study actually found that the electrical firing of those TAC1 cells scales in direct proportion to the size of the deficit. It is a literal gradient. Scientists could look at a brain scan and calculate exactly how many expected treats were withheld just based on the violent intensity of the neural response. Because your hopeful expectation was so incredibly high, and the reality was absolute 0, your TAC1 disappointment meter isn't just firing, it is redlining at its absolute biological limit. No wonder you feel a sense of total systemic shutdown.
Part 3. The error correction machine.
So let's step back for a second and look at the macro behavioral application of all this. Your TAC1 cells are screaming at maximum volume. What is this actually meant to achieve for you? The lead authors of this study make a profound point that completely reframes this entire experience. They note that this highly specific TAC1 circuit is emphatically not a signal of systemic failure. Quite the opposite, actually. It is the brain's primary error correction machine executing its evolutionary mandate. It is working exactly as designed to force a change.
The purpose of this flop signal, this overwhelming wave of empty pointlessness you are currently navigating, is intensely practical. As Kana Suzuki notes, you inevitably have to use the history of your successes and failures to make a different choice next time. This biological circuit exists for recognizing prediction errors, changing suboptimal strategies, and ultimately driving healthy perseverance. It forces you to realize that your predictive model was wrong, so you don't just keep pouring extremely expensive 2E bioenergetic resources into a dark terminal. So we end with this. Your metabolic bankruptcy today is real, it is scientifically measurable, and it is entirely valid. But it is not the end of the story. If this feeling isn't a failure, but a high-fidelity alarm from your brain's error correction machine, what behavior is it telling you to change? What new strategy is this biological signal pushing you toward? Use the data, read the meter, and adjust the model. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time.